Okay, so hello everyone, beaming live to you from Special Collections in the library. As Rachel's just said, what we're hoping to do is we're going to be talking about our copy of the First Folio, also sharing it with you. So I am now going to do that. So here we have, this is our copy of the 1623 First Folio. You can see down here at the bottom, we've got the imprint as printed by Isaac Jaggard in 1623. And what I want to do first of all is just basically try and this is the iconic first page with the very famous portrait of the rather baldy looking Shakespeare. I should say as well that I'm joined secretly in this endeavour by my colleague Bob McLean, who's very kindly going to be zooming in and showing the copy to you. So what I'm going to start off with briefly is just to try and give you an indication of the size of the book. I'll just put my hand next to it, and Bob can zoom out again. Without going into all the ins and outs of the technicalities of printing, I just want to explain briefly that when we refer to the First Folio, the folio part of the description is referring to the format of the book and how the paper has been arranged and folded. And to cut a long story short, these are generally quite large books in size and quite extensively produced. And of course, as well, forgive me for saying that, of course, in 1623, this was the only folio publication of Shakespeare's works, and it only came to be known as the First Folio later, after the publication of subsequent editions in 1632, 1664, and 1685. But at this point, I'm just going to invite Adrian perhaps to tell us a little bit about why the book is so important.
Thanks, Julie. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. The book is important for reasons that are obvious and I suppose reasons that are less obvious. The obvious reason why the book is important is that half of the plays that we have of Shakespeare's are only printed in the First Folio. And so what's commonly said by scholars is that if we didn't have the First Folio, we wouldn't have those plays. It may be the case that if the First Folio had not been printed, we may have ended up with some of these plays, but for example, plays like Macbeth, Twelfth Night, and The Tempest are unique to the First Folio. So imagining a dramatic world, a literary world, a cultural world without those plays, I think is quite a thought. One of the things that people often ask about the First Folio is it a rare book? And in 17th century terms, not especially, there are over 230 verified copies of the book that exist today. And so in terms of rarity, it isn't particularly rare. However, its value is something that is rather different, and we can talk about its monetary value, which is significant. Copies regularly sell for millions of pounds at auction, but we can also talk, I think, about its cultural value. And Emma Smith, who is the great authority really on the First Folio, Emma Smith from the University of Oxford, talks about the book as a fetish, and I think that's a really interesting word. Fetish means something that has magical powers. It means something too that inspires excessive devotion. And so the cult of Shakespeare, the bard, the great Swan of Avon, this figure of great national and indeed global importance as his reputation has developed over the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, means that the book signifies something beyond the words on the page. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important. Shakespeare today in the 21st century is a global figure, a cultural figure across several media. So not just in terms of theatre and drama, but also music, painting, film, radio, digital media, you name it. There are multiple and myriad ways in which Shakespeare has been appropriated. And so Shakespeare is very much of his time. He is a late 16th and early 17th century dramatist, and he shares and interrogates the concerns of his time. But he's also somebody who is, I think, endlessly adaptable, and that's one of the reasons why we return to him again and again, unlike many of his contemporaries who are, I would argue, more context bound to their period. Shakespeare enables people to do multiple things with him, some of which he may not indeed have recognised. A couple of other quick things to say about the significance of the book. It's only the plays, so the poems, the sonnets, the narrative poems aren't included in the First Folio, and that in itself I think is significant and interesting. And also, we should think of the long period of historical time over which these plays were written. So they were written under two monarchs. Shakespeare starts writing at towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign, probably in the late 1580s, and he concludes writing in the 1610s, in the middle of James the First and Sixth's reign. And he writes for a series of dramatic companies as well, Lord Strange's Men, Pembroke's Men, later the King's Men. So he has to adapt to the very different political, religious regimes of those two monarchs, and the plays very much reflect that difference in historical context too. And the final thing to say as well is that the plays in the First Folio aren't organised in any sense sort of chronologically. They're organised according to genre, but one of the things that I think is significant about the plays is that they are written for a variety of different venues. So, for example, early on in his career, he writes Titus Andronicus for the Rose Theatre. He writes for the Inns of Court. So these are the law courts, the places where, rather the kind of mini universities really, where lawyers were trained. She writes the Comedy of Errors, for example, for there. He writes for the Globe. Henry V refers to the Globe in the prologue to the play, and he also writes for the court under Elizabeth and James. Measure for Measure, for example, was performed in front of James, and from 1609 he writes several plays for the indoor Blackfriars Theatre, for example, The Winter's Tale. And the Blackfriars Theatre offers different opportunities, dramatic opportunities. So more involved stage machinery, music, artificial light, for example. So you're not reliant upon the sun, and also more expensive to get into. So a different clientele, I suppose, from the very mixed clientele that would have attended plays at the Globe. So I think those are some of the reasons why this is such an important book. I'll hand back now to Julie.
Well, I love what you or Emma has said about it being a fetish and so magical. What I kind of hope one have shared today is why our copy is particularly magical. But just first, just to pick up on what you were just saying there, Adrian, about I think how important it is to remember that this is a book which is recording plays that were designed for performance. And I think one of the ways in which the First Folio references the plays as they were originally enacted in all these different theatres that you mentioned is that it includes a list of all the names of the actors in Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, who were involved in the original performances, and that is the page that you can see here. And I think it's here that our copy becomes really exciting and unique. So you can see here that we've got some annotations next to the names in a contemporary hand. And these are making comments like hearsay next to William Osler there, and by eyewitness next to John Lowen. And the name of Shakespeare's name, which heads the list, has got this really intriguing comment, least for making. And that probably could be interpreted as meaning that Shakespeare acted in the plays least of all, since he was busy writing and producing them. But I think what this tells us is that this early annotator owner is somebody who actually saw the plays being acted at the time. So I'm going to pass over to Adrian again here, who can hopefully tell us a little bit more about these actors.
Yes, so the actors here, the principal actors that are named, there's a variety of them, and some of them are very well known and some of them are much less well known. So Julie and I thought that it would be interesting to maybe say a little bit about these actors and who they were, and some of you may be familiar with these and others of you might not. But the second name that you can see there after Shakespeare's is that of Richard Burbage. And Richard Burbage, sorry, my camera keeps going off. Richard Burbage was the leading actor of Shakespeare's companies, leading actor of the King's Men. And Burbage played, therefore, many of the famous, iconic roles in the Shakespearean canon. So he played Henry V, he played Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, amongst others, for the first time. So a really important figure, and someone who worked very much in collaboration with Shakespeare, not just in terms of acting and theatrical work, but also as a business partner, as well as a shareholder in the King's Men. We sometimes forget that all of these guys were in this business to make money, and they made money as well from their theatrical activities. And so they worked closely together to think about what was not just dramatically useful and important, but also what would sell, what people would come and see, what they would want to come and see, and what they could make money from. The next actor I'm going to talk a little bit about, if Bob could maybe move it down a bit, is Robert Lowen. And you can see, hopefully, Robert Lowen a bit further down. Sorry, John Lowen, my mistake, I'm misreading my notes here. John Lowen, who the annotator of this text knew, or at least knew somebody who knew of him. And Lowen is well known in the period, quite a long-lived man, as a big imposing figure, and he kind of played the secondary roles in the King's Men. So he may have played Falstaff. He may also have played Henry VIII in one of Shakespeare's last plays, Henry VIII, which was written in collaboration with John Fletcher, who later became one of the important dramatists for the King's Men after Shakespeare's retirement. And he became this sort of second actor after Shakespeare and Burbage's death. And as I said, he was quite long-lived, and that's interesting in itself, because after the theatres were shut down in 1562 on the order of Parliament, it seems that Lowen and some others in the company, the King's Men, continued performing surreptitiously, so illegally. And he may well have been arrested in 1648 and briefly imprisoned, indeed, for surreptitiously playing plays when they were officially banned. And he died in 1653 at the age of 76. So he was somebody who saw the civil wars, he saw the execution of Charles I, a very long-lived figure. And the last person I'm going to say a wee bit about is Nathan Field. And Nathan Field, who you can see on the right-hand column there, Nathan Field first came to prominence as a boy actor, and there were several boy actors who played in various companies across the theatrical field in London, but Nathan Field was particularly well known for his beauty, his handsomeness, his good looks, and also his dramatic range. And as he grew up, he moved on to adult parts in playing adult parts for the King's Men. But he also was a playwright too in his own right, and he wrote in collaboration, for example, with Philip Massenger, another really important dramatist of the 1620s and 30s and indeed the early 40s. And Field is an example of that kind of crossover between people who act on stage but who also write on stage, just like Shakespeare himself. So Shakespeare is following in a dramatic tradition of being both an actor, a writer, and a business person. And all of these people, to some extent, you could categorize in that way. I'll hand over to Julie now again, who's going to talk a little bit about the book itself.
Right, so what I want to just return to are the annotations in this copy, because it's, to me, this is what is magical about our copy, and this to me is what gives us this kind of really direct connection straight to the past. So the first thing I need to point out is that we only get these in the very first section of the book, in the comedies. So the opening I'm showing you here is we've got the end of the Merry Wives of Windsor, and we've got the beginning of Measure for Measure. And if you have a look, just at the bottom of the page here, you might notice that there's quite a discernible use of different page lengths here. This is different pages which have all been put together. So what we actually have here is what's called a made-up copy of the First Folio. It uses leaves from at least 3 and maybe more First Folio copies, and kind of vampment of entire copies from several different incomplete copies of this way was a fairly common practice in the 18th century, and a number of booksellers were known to have kept incomplete copies of the books in stock in order to cobble them together in this way. So I actually often do wonder if there's some counterpart pages of the annotated copy out there. And you see this quite clearly. The page on the left has got annotations, the page on the right hasn't. So these are 2 different copies which have been brought together at some point. So returning to the marginalia, obviously these are incredibly valuable as direct evidence of what was important to a contemporary reader. So you can see how they directly engage with Shakespeare at the time. You can see that they highlight sections of text which were particularly of interest to them just by underlining pieces of text. And you can see that they also use this little device app next to parts of the text. And we think that is short for the Latin approbo, I approve. So they're the bits of the plays that, that they really, really liked. Even better, the annotator has left us some summaries of what they thought of the plays, and it gives us a sense of whether they enjoyed or didn't enjoy some of the plays. So you can see here at the end of the Merry Wives of Windsor, they thought that this was very good, light. I'm just going to move on to show you one of my kind of favourite summary of the text. Which you can see here is actually the end of the 2 Gentlemen of Verona, and they thought that was stark naught. So that was a rather disparaging assessment. The Tempest, meanwhile, they liked pretty well. And there's another play which they think is Bon for Bon. So that's what our reader thought of in the 1620s. Now you might be thinking, who on earth could this annotator have been? So we have actually got a little clue. Now very often, early owners and readers of books do sometimes, if they're very helpful, leave us their names. And we can see that halfway through the 2 Gentlemen of Verona, we've got the autograph of someone here, and this is Lorenzo Carey. So again, I'm going to pass back to Adrian, who hopefully can tell us a little bit more about who Lorenzo Carey was.
Thanks, Julie. Lorenzo Carey was born in 1613, and he died in one of the earliest battles of the English Civil Wars in 1642. And he comes from a really interesting family. His father was Henry Carey, who was a prominent politician. And during the 1620s, he was the Lord Deputy of Ireland. So he essentially ran Ireland for the British state at that point. And Lorenzo's mother was also a really important figure. She was called Elizabeth Carey, and Elizabeth was famous as the first woman author of an original play published in English, a play called The Tragedy of Mariam. So playwriting, theatre is very much part of the Carey household, I think we can say. Another interesting thing about this family, when Lorenzo was 13, his parents became estranged, and this was because Elizabeth converted to Catholicism and Henry wasn't having it, and Henry wanted a divorce, and he treated Elizabeth appallingly, and even the king got involved at one point. Charles I got involved in this dispute because they were a really prominent aristocratic family. And one of the things that Elizabeth did was she took 4 of her daughters off to the continent, and the daughters all became nuns. So it's a really fascinating story. And if we can date these annotations, as people like Emma Smith and others have suggested, to the late 1620s or the early 1630s, that means that Lorenzo was still a teenager when he was making these annotations. And he was making these annotations at a time when his parents were involved in this acrimonious, high-profile separation. And one of the things that Julie was saying was that it's the comedies that are annotated, and particularly he seems really interested in the Merry Wives of Windsor. And I was thinking about this the other day and wondering, what why might that be important? And I mean, it occurred to me that this is a play about families. It's a play about marital problems in particular. And Lorenzo marks one passage about Ford as a character in the play, Ford's jealousy of his wife, and he comments at that point, a good jealous man's dilemma. So, I mean, this is speculation. I don't know whether this carries any weight. I'd need to look at the annotations in more detail, but I think it's, it is interesting, surely, that he is looking at a play about men and women, about wives, about families, and annotating it really heavily at a time when his parents were involved in this very acrimonious divorce and separation. I'll hand back over now to Julie.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely fascinating. That's something I've never really thought about in terms of the Merry Wives of Windsor and the annotation. So I think it would be like really incredibly interesting to go through and sort of analyse what is Lorenzo or one of the Carey family looking at. I think we are sort of reaching the end and starting to run out of time a little bit. So I think if we want to take questions, I was just going to briefly mention the kind of later history of the book. I'll leave it open here at the start of the page of the Tempest. You might just notice we've got this the signature there, Inchquin, and that's the 5th Earl of Inchquin, an MP, Murrow of Bryan, who owned the book at the end of the 18th century. He's thought to have bought it in 1780 or thereabouts. I just want to mention, just because it's again just a great thing, that was known as to be something of a bon vivant, and he is referred to in his obituary as being a 6-bottle-a-day man. So I like to think that maybe he's the person who was responsible. Maybe he spilled his wine all over the copy, and that's why it was maybe broken up and dilapidated, and then had to be brought back together again with other copies at the beginning of the 19th century. I don't know, but I just like to think of him, hazily consulting it as he imbibes his claret. But I think maybe we'll stop there. We could go on and about this forever, I think. But I think if we maybe see if anyone has any questions.
Yes, we can.
Right. So this is the front cover of the book. So it is actually probably again, this is a bit of a Frankenstein, like the text within there. This part here is probably late 17th century. It's kind of very worn, as you can see, but it's actually feathered on to a later binding here, which is probably 19th century, and then later on it's been rebacked in the 20th century. Now, sometimes you can tell if people have got their stamps on bindings, like if that gives us any clues to provenance. And there is, you might just be able to make out here, there is this kind of quite nice ornament in the middle, and there's some very ghostly initials here, EL. Now that doesn't really help us in the sort of to try and fill in all the gaps of the provenance of this. And we have to think as well that if we think this book was put together, but this binding might not have, say, originally belonged to the Carey copy of the folio, or even First Folio at all. It might have come from a completely different book, so we're not sure. But anyway, but it's still quite a nice binding, so I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Julie. We've got a question here as well from Baz. When were the sonnets first published and how were they received at the time?
They were published in 1609, I think, if I remember correctly, in an edition. And how were they received at the time? I mean, Shakespeare was well known as a poet, and it seems that when the theatres were shut down at various points for the plague, he turned to poetry and wrote his narrative poems, and probably wrote the sonnets at various points throughout his career, which were gathered then together in 1609. So before the publication of the First Folio.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks very much, Adrian. Thanks, Baz, for your question. We've got a question here as well from Giovanna. I think, Adrian, Julie, you can both see the chat, can't you? But I will read it out. So across all of the First Folios, what sort of reconciliation comparison has there been about the autographs there and the writing in the margins? Do they suggest a network of readers at any one point in time, or is the sample too small to say?
Yeah, I think that the sample is too small to say. There are a few other copies which are annotated. There's one in Japan in particular, and I think you do get quite a few other annotated copies. Also not just contemporary ones, but people who are then annotated in the 18th and 19th centuries and so on. I'm not, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's one which suggests that, you know, it's like the same people annotating different copies or thereabouts, if that's the question there. I'm sure there were networks of readers, but I don't think there's the evidence of that actually for the books themselves.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, there has been a bit of work done on this, and it's interesting to think about who owned the First Folios as well. I mean, it seems, as you would imagine, aristocrats, theatre people, actors, but also some clergy, some people of the sort of middling sort, and there's evidence of women owning the First Folio too. But in terms of contemporary annotations, I mean, that's a trickier one. The largest grouping of First Folios is held at Folger's Shakespeare Library in Washington, DC. So I imagine that would be a fantastic project for someone to go through and see if they could make those connections.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Giovanna, for your question there. So we've got a few more questions coming through in the chat. How did the library actually end up getting this copy? Do we know that?
You know that? So first of all, obviously, as we can see, the university didn't buy a copy in the 17th century, and this copy had a previous ownership. But this came to us as part of a fantastic bequest of books by a Glasgow insurance broker called William Ewing. He actually acquired the book in the 1850s from the Shakespearean bookseller editor James Orchard Halliwell Phillips, and he bequeathed. And anyway, William Ewing then accrued it along with about 12,000 other great books, and he donated his entire library to the university, and it arrived in 1874. And incidentally, there's also a copy of the second folio, Shakespeare folio, in that collection too, as well as a couple of quarters, I think. So yeah, so it's a great collection.
Thank you. We've got a question here as well from Graham. Are there any textual differences in the plays across the different folios?
Do you want to answer that, Adrian? Yes.
Yeah, lots. No copy of the First Folio is the same. These were all set, mechanic by hand, and then printed on printing presses. So this is prior to mechanized printing, and it took roughly about 2 years from when they started to when they finished all the First Folios too. And then there's lots of evidence of what we would refer to now as textual variants, and scholars have spent their entire careers puzzling over these, and whether these were meant or whether these were just a consequence of a typesetter not having the right word or letter when they're putting a page together, whether there's some sort of authorial intention behind these or not. So it's a huge field, and there are many differences, for example, between some of the folio texts and some of the quarto texts. The quartos are the smaller sort of pamphlet sized texts that were printed of the plays prior to the First Folio. A couple of famous examples: Othello, the quarto versions and the folio versions are quite different in many respects textually. Hamlet as well, there are several versions of that play. So yes, I mean that's the kind of direct answer, but I'm sure Julie, you would want to add to that as well.
Yeah, I know. I think that sums it up nicely. Yeah, I mean there are lots of differences. Across books. I was kind of slightly because I just noticed there was a question from Lauren that you just asking about the annotation under John Lowndes' name. I won't share the screen again, but that actually says by eyewitness. That's one of the annotations there that the reader has actually seen John Lowndes. And Lauren's also asking to repeat the dates of Lorenzo Carey's birth and death. You got that, Adrian?
Yeah, born in 1613 and died in 1642.
Great, okay, thank you. Thanks very much. We've just got a couple more questions. Let me see here. We've got one from Louise, who especially enjoyed the insights into the practicalities of theatre making, including the particular opportunities provided by individual theatres. Does the First Folio offer more clues into these first productions of Shakespeare's plays?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Louise. Oh goodness, I wish we had another couple of hours. Yes, it does. Goodness, what can we say? Well, the variety, I talked earlier on about the Blackfriars Theatre, so the variety of stage directions and information about the music that was performed as well. Those give us a real insight into the way in which Shakespeare was writing for that particular theatre and exploiting I suppose the new technology really that theatre afforded him. And some of you may know that there is an indoor theatre that the Shakespeare's Globe down in London has opened up about I think 10 years ago or so, and it's a fantastic place, and if you ever get the opportunity to go to it, it really is a very different experience of a Shakespeare play. It's much more intimate. As I say, the light is artificial. It's lit. I believe I'm right in saying it's the only public building in London that is allowed to be lit by candles. They got special dispensation for that, and so this kind of crepuscular atmosphere that you get in many of the late plays, for example, like The Winter's Tale, you know, this sort of shadowy world, I suppose, of things that are kind of half seen or not properly seen. And if you think of the end of The Winter's Tale, when the statue comes back to life, and that's something that you can imagine Shakespeare doing for that theatre in that time and in that place that probably wouldn't work quite as well in an open air theatre where you've got natural light and so forth. So that idea of disguise and of magic and of am I seeing what I think I'm seeing is also part of that too. And you can certainly see that in the text for something like The Winter's Tale.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Adrian. Thanks, Louise, as well. I think we've just got one more question or comment kind of from NS, which I really agree with, and I was a bit confused about as well. Kerry, the annotator, were they aware of the proverbial immortality of this book that may have kind of made them choose to put their name down into the book? I mean, is that not quite unusual to be scribbling all over a text? And I would guess the book would be quite expensive at that time, would it not?
It was a very expensive text. I think that's a really interesting kind of thing to think about. So first of all, I would have thought that, I mean, there's a lot about why people sign their names in books and where people sign their names in books. First of all, it's not unusual at all for people to scribble on their books at this point in history. At this point, in fact, that was encouraged for people to kind of own and personalise their own texts, and this goes really back to kind of manuscript culture, I suppose. There's a thing like called commonplacing, where people would basically take meaning from the text they read and make them their own by doing all that kind of underline and marking the passages which were of particular importance to themselves. I think it's also got to remember that at this point, people didn't necessarily have they didn't have as much stationery as we do. So things like margins were particularly left quite wide in order that people could write comments and marginalia and put the sort of the keywords, and that helps them kind of make it their own copy, if you like, and it also helps them find the pertinent parts of texts or pieces of work or whatever quickly, because they've kind of marked it in this way. I mean, people obviously put their names to books as a mark of ownership and also belonging. And what I like about this, and what you see quite commonly, is that the usual place where you think people would mark their name is usually at the beginning of a book. But in this case, he's put his name halfway through The Two Gentlemen of Verona. Now, I have to sort of add wonder, like, why at that point? Where is there something significant? And I was just sort of thinking what Adrian was saying about the fact that he marks up the Merry Wives of Windsor so much. And that might be something to do with the marital strife that was going on at the time, and that play is particularly pertinent to him. So maybe we could have a look. So the Two Gentlemen of Verona, maybe it's something to do with the relationship with his brother Lucius or something. I don't know. But anyway, I think it was a very personal thing, and I don't think it was because he thought, oh, like 400 years later, we're all going to be sitting in a room talking about this and wondering why I signed my name at this point, and I'm going to go down in history for doing this, although that's certainly what has happened.